repairing the X-ray scanners that they use at the bases to check people and trucks for bombs. And at that point in my life, I had been fired from a charter school that I founded. My marriage was ending, and I lived in a place where periodically sirens would tell me that I had to run for a bunker because there were incoming rockets. So there were mysteries like, what the heck is going on in my life? And one day I was wandering around the base in Kandahar Airfield, and I came across a flyer tacked up on a bulletin board for, of all things, a Unitarian Universalist worship service. And it had a chalice, it even had a rainbow, our people, and I was totally stunned. And it turns out that in the middle of this brutal, ugly, hot, dusty, violent place, there was an oasis. And I'd been a Unitarian Universalist since the early 90s, but I'd always been in places like Boston and DC, where the culture on the street was progressive and not all that different from the culture in the sanctuary. And now, for the first time, I was in a place where my UU church was truly a sanctuary, an oasis where I could find consolation with people who shared my values. So on Veterans Day of that year, our minister, First Lieutenant Chris Antal, Unitarian Universalist, also known as Reverend Chris, on Veterans Day, he gave a sermon entitled, "A Veterans Day Confession for America." And I bet you can guess how his sermon went. So in this sermon, he talked about how America celebrates war and treats its soldiers and veterans poorly. And everyone in that room, in that little plywood sanctuary, was either an active duty soldier holding a weapon in their laps or a veteran like me. And we were fine with the sermon. It was our lived experience. But Reverend Chris's superiors got wind of it, and he got relieved of his command and sent home. There is no freedom of the pulpit in a war zone. And before he left, Reverend Chris took me aside, and he asked me to become the lay leader of our little fellowship. And I said, "Rev, do you have any idea what kind of person I am?" And I made 100 other excuses and about why I couldn't do it. And Chaplain Chris just said, "You're doing it." And when your chaplain in Afghanistan says you're doing it, you're doing it. So I took over and I gave terrible sermons, and I fumbled my way through the rituals, and I was terrified the whole time. And I feel bad for the folks in Kandahar who sat through those services. Like, you should thank them, actually. But they stuck around, and we made community, and I realized that I really loved what we were doing and what I was doing. So here's a news flash from Captain Obvious. War has a way of clarifying your priorities. And I had thought about seminary before then, but now I realized in that moment that I needed to do it. Time to stop fooling around. And out of the mystery of a miserable place in my life came that new voice, a calling. And I was called. And 2 months after I got back from Afghanistan, I was in Chicago starting my education at Meadville Lombard Theological School. I was on my way. So that's a decent story, right? It's a good story. And it's actually mostly true, and makes a nice, neat portrayal of how calling works, But that's not really the whole story. And I think the real mystery of calling is that callings aren't neat. Callings don't have clear beginnings and endings. And in my case, the real story of my calling, at least to the ministry, started way before my time in Afghanistan and will continue for a long, long time. There are these romantic illusions about calling, which I think are part of why callings seem kind of mysterious. And if you looked at my website and learned a little about me, you probably realize that I've done a lot of different things. And I'm 56 years old, and so much of my life has just been me casting around for direction. I've always drawn to work that had meaning. Making meaning is very important to me. Big surprise for a UU minister. But the source of that meaning evolved as I got older. The idealism that drew me to the Marine Corps when I was 24 is not the same idealism that led me to become an advocate for after-school programs for youth when I was 40. And the things that call me continue to evolve. And this is different from the romantic illusion of a person having this giant epiphany, this moment when the burning bush speaks to them and their purpose is set for life. In that calling fantasy, we expect that the clouds are supposed to part, and there's the message is presented with great fanfare. All those years that I was seeking, I could have used some fanfare. Like, where are the trumpets? Susan Peck, can you help me with trumpets? I was totally an ad lib. Thank you, Susan. Oh my gosh, I so love working for a great music director. So lucky. Thank you. So maybe another service we'll do the trumpet thing in a little more, detail. But I think finding a calling, a vocation, isn't one decision in our lives. It's a decision every day. Actually, it's 100 decisions each day. They aren't a moment a calling. Calling is a way of being. And churches have callings too. And for churches, there are so many sources of that calling that actually it is fair to call it a mystery there. The calling lies embedded in the mission statements and the budgets and the hiring decisions. The calling is brought to the church by the city that washes up against the walls of our campus here, by the people driving by the folks who sleep on the church's sidewalk. The calling comes from the hundreds of people who come to this sanctuary every week to be fed, and who sit in our classrooms, and who come together to make the music that soothes and inspires us. Over the past week, I'm glad you're here, Alan. I really am. Over the past week, I had 100 conversations with people in this congregation who are bringing their callings to this place. And the sum of their callings becomes the calling of this church. Some of your callings becomes the calling of this church. This week I saw those callings manifest in so many ways. I met folks doing the work of justice, and I am so impressed by their passion and by their nuanced analysis and their discerning between doing the desperately needed work of direct service and doing the long, grinding work of systemic change. So sophisticated. I met with program leaders who give so generously of their time and their energy to weave the fabric of this community. I met the members of the board who work hard to be loving stewards of this institution. I met folks who care deeply about developing the Unitarian Universalist identity of our children and youth. And I sat with the staff and the ministers who bring all of themselves to this calling. And as an aside, I want to say one of the reasons I'm here is I am 100% in support of Reverend Angela's vision for this community. So over this week, I met people who, as Marge Piercy puts it, strain in the mud and muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. These folks, and I know many, many more that I haven't met yet, have callings. Calling becomes purpose. And I have my own ideas about purposes of a church. I think folks come looking for community and for consolation, because life is super hard, and for guidance and for inspiration to act on that guidance. Folks come to First U for these reasons, and surely lots of other reasons too. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about this. Everything we do here is an act of co-creation. It's an act of co-creation. It's our community, no single person, that makes things happen. And the more everyone shows up for this co-creation, the better the result. So with all that in mind, what's the calling that we're here for? For sure, there's not just one. But I want to tell you about one of my real calls right now and why I think folks in this church have it too. It's a story, something that happened to me recently in my own congregation. So just last Sunday, I was coming into my office at the congregation I'm serving now in Salt Lake City. I was getting ready for worship. And as I was walking in the office, the phone rang, and the phone doesn't ring that often on Sunday morning. It was a gentleman who got stranded in Salt Lake City. And I'll call him John. Real name's not John. And John is a member of a small UU fellowship in a big West Coast city. And John was in trouble. John's in his 50s. John has full-blown AIDS. And a little while back, John told him that he had 5, maybe 6 months to live. When John got this news, he resolved to visit his family on the East Coast one more time. And this decision was an act of grace and courage. When John came out to his family decades ago, they disowned him. They were part of a homophobic Christian tradition, and they threw him out of the house. That's when John made his way to the West Coast. And despite this terrible history, John had hoped for a reconciliation in this moment. He told me that his partner of 20 years had died a year ago, and when that happened, when he lost his chosen family, he thought perhaps his family of origin would have a change of heart. So John took the train from the West Coast to the East Coast, and the trip took a huge toll on John's health. And when he got there, he ended up spending 2 months in the local hospital there. And when he was well enough to get out of the hospital, he met with his family, and he explained the full extent of his illness and its cause. And their response was to throw him out of the house again, to literally throw his luggage on the lawn. It seems that since the last time he saw them, they became affiliated with the Westboro Church, and they were worse than ever. So in an act of real cruelty, they kept his train ticket. So here he is. Somehow John found a friend of a friend who just happened to be driving from the city he was in on the East Coast to Salt Lake City, only as far as Salt Lake City. So he took the ride because he figured it would get him closer to home. And he got sick again on the way, and when he got to Salt Lake City, he had to spend 2 weeks in the hospital. And when he got out, he managed to get another train ticket, and he was going to go home the next day, the following Monday after that Sunday he called. But he was out of money, and out of friends, and out of hope. And here's the thing. So he called us. He called the Unitarian Universalist Church. And this phone call is where my calling comes from, and maybe yours too. He called our little UU society because he hoped to find some shelter from the storm. He called the UUs because we are the place where we don't turn people away because of who they love. He called us because we are life-affirming and life-changing and life-saving. And we, that little church in Salt Lake, we answered that call. There's nothing fancy that we did, groceries, a little cash, maybe an hour of my time. But we answered. Our calling as UUs, it's not a mystery. It's not some whispering in the night or fanfare or trumpets. Our calling, the calling that we share as Unitarian Universalists, is to listen to the pain of the world. To listen to the pain of the world and say, here we are. How can we help? Here we are. How can we help? This is a special moment we're in right now as a country and as a planet. And when I say special, I don't mean special in a good way. And right now, we members of this progressive tradition are constantly witnessing things that we know in our heart are not right. And that takes a toll. We're being wounded daily, receiving a slow-motion trauma on top of all the traumas we just carried because we are alive and living our lives. And in this time of trauma, more than ever, we need to listen to our callings and to honor our callings and to follow our callings. Folks, my calling brought me here to First Unitarian Church in Albuquerque for us to answer our calls together, all of us. I got ordained on March 18th, 2018, not that long ago. And I want to finish by saying some of the words that were said on that day. As part of the act of ordination, the chair of the board of First Unitarian Universalist Church in Niagara Falls, she said this to me: "May you minister from your whole self, heart and mind, body and spirit. May you always speak the truth as you know it, with courage and wisdom. Demonstrate grace, gentleness, and good humor. Celebrate the mystery and wonder of life. Share in the joys and sorrows of our human condition. Embody the living tradition of our faith. And above all, serve the world with compassion and love." And I said, "I vow to serve with a deep sense of obligation and opportunity, mindful of the privileges and responsibilities of ministry. I vow to always remember the most vulnerable among us and to work to make a more just and caring world. With profound gratitude to all who have journeyed before me and beside me, I will keep alive the meanings of this service." I bring these big vows to First Unitarian Church of Albuquerque, and I say, so come, let us answer our calls together. Amen, and blessed be. Let's sing hymn number 1018 in our teal hymnal.
Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound, Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. There'll be a freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be a freedom in that land where I'm bound, There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land where I'm bound. There'll be justice. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound, There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound, There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm bound, There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm bound.
Let us answer our calls together, that we may together make a more just and caring world. Our worship is over. Our service begins. Go in peace, gentle people.